Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Tamara Rozouvan and you're watching UATV. Canada's support for Ukrainian defense, security and territorial integrity through its military training program is unwavering. However, there are calls for the Trudeau government to do more, whether that's through an international peacekeeping mission being sent to war-torn Donbas or to bolster military training and cooperation between the two countries. So what can be done? Joining us today to discuss this and more is Colonel Robert Foster. He's the Defense Attaché at the Canadian Embassy here in Ukraine.
No problem. Good to see you.
Before we talk about the Canadian military training, I'd like to talk to you more about the sort of disengagement that's happening now in eastern Ukraine that President Zelensky initiated. And obviously, some people saw it as a concession. Others did not. How was it seen in Ottawa?
From an Ottawa perspective, it's seen as an opportunity to get peaceful dialogue going. And so what we have seen is that the three disengagement zones that have been created have allowed President Zelensky to reach out to President Putin and to restart the Normandy 4 talks, which will take place on the 9th of December. And from a Canadian perspective, that's excellent. It's all about trying to get a peaceful resolution through diplomatic means.
Was it seen more as a step towards peace or frozen conflict?
I think it's a step towards peace. I think the word that we would use in Ottawa is that we're all cautiously optimistic that there will be change, and we have seen President Zelensky so far deliver on all the things that he's said he was going to do. He already initiated a prisoner exchange. He was able to secure the return of the 3 naval vessels as well. So this is another positive step in his role as president to try and come to an agreement to the end of the conflict.
Do you see it as part of the sort of disengagement that started in the east, in eastern Ukraine, and the return of the Navy vessels and return of the Navy personnel that happened in September? Do you see that as sort of a broader strategy for peace?
I think it is. I think it's, I don't know what, President Zelensky's ultimate plan is, but from everything that we have seen so far, his immediate desire is really to end the conflict and try and bring peace and try and reestablish normalcy in the Donbas region. And the only way to do that is to have a peaceful dialogue. So he's establishing that through the Normandy 4. That is the primary means for diplomatic negotiations. So it's a great step forward.
Was this discussed between the Ukrainian Defense Minister and the Canadian Defense Minister at the Halifax International Security Forum?
Yes, they had a very good bilateral meeting. I wasn't present, of course, but Minister Zagoragnek was accompanied by one of his deputy ministers, Lena Frolova. We had on our side Minister Sejan, who was just recently reappointed as the Minister for Defense. He was joined with our Deputy Minister and with our Assistant Deputy Minister Policy and our Chief of Defense Staff. From what I understand, it was a very good dialogue. There was a lot of opportunities that were discussed. They talked about, in broad terms, the idea of how peace needs to be established, and that was the desire of President Zelensky. And from my understanding, everyone was in agreement that the Normandy format was the way to go.
What other key topics were discussed?
They talked about greater cooperation between the two countries. Minister Zagoragnek confirmed that he was very happy with the support that he receives from both Op Unifier, which is our training mission here in Ukraine, but he was also very satisfied with the work of the group that's called the Defense Reform Advisory Board. Canada plays an active role in that with one key member. And he was also talked about the role of command and control within the Ministry of Defense and within the General Staff. And Canada has been playing an active role in supporting that effort as well.
During an interview for a Canadian media outlet, Ukraine's defense minister, he expressed interest in sharing the country's military experience fighting Russia. And Can you talk a bit about the practical side? What would a Ukraine-Canada military experience exchange look like?
That's a good question. So my understanding is that because of the conflict over so many years, Ukraine has experienced a number of different activities by the Russians, and there is always an opportunity for us to share and trade information, if you will, lessons learned. And so the idea is that Minister Zagorodniak is looking to create a NATO Center of Excellence on lessons learned, focused on hybrid warfare. Canada would be a participant in that, or has been asked if we want to be a participant. We haven't confirmed yes or no, although we are extremely interested. And I think what will end up happening is the key areas that we're interested in are really the cyber piece. How does Russia attack us in terms of our networks and attack Ukraine in terms of its networks? And also social media and disinformation, because we're finding obviously in this era of fake news, very often we see that coming out in spades, and we want to understand, how do you deal with it at a practical level, at the soldier level?
So the Center of Excellence, I think you mentioned, would that be in Ukraine?
I believe so. I think that would be the intent, although I don't have specific details about it. It could be located anywhere, and it could be that Ukraine contributes to it, or it could be actually established here, and that's something for the Ukrainian government to decide.
The idea of a Canada-led UN peacekeeping mission being sent to Donbas. This was previously spearheaded by the former Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko. So what conditions do you think would need to be met in order for a Canada-led peacekeeping mission to happen?
So first of all, that came out, as you said, it was under the previous president when it was first broached. It was recently mentioned in a sidebar, I believe, at a Canadian-Ukrainian Congress back a month ago or so, or at the beginning of this month at the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress, where Deputy Minister Bondar from the Foreign Affairs had mentioned it. I can't personally say whether Canada would lead a peacekeeping operation. That's certainly above my pay grade. But the fact that the Ukrainian government has suggested it or proposed it would be certainly something that my government would consider if it was acceptable to the United Nations, if it was acceptable to the international community. I think the challenge will be is what comes out of the Normandy 4 talks on the 9th of December and the next steps, and whether or not the two sides agree to a peacekeeping force. And that really is the crux of the issue. Would Russia welcome that or not?
How would a Canadian-led peace plan in eastern Ukraine look like?
I think what would end up happening is that peace in Ukraine has really got to be led by what Ukraine wants, what sovereignty needs to look like. And to say what Canada wants, I don't think is appropriate. I think it's really about what does Ukraine want, and I think what does the Russians want, and what do the non-governmental controlled territories right now, what do they want? And I think that needs to be discussed before we even get into anything about a UN-led or a Canadian-led peacekeeping force.
There's obviously a lot of interest because Ukraine sees Canada as just a strong and reliable partner. This is why perhaps that's something the defense minister has also spoken about, a potentially more hands-on approach from the Canadian side.
No, absolutely. And Canada is unwavering in our support of Ukraine, which when you think of a peaceful resolution or trying to create a peacekeeping force, when you are so pro-Ukrainian, you would think that the other side might not be so welcoming to having a Canadian force. So that's the challenge that we've got. And that's why we have to be very cautious to say Canada isn't, it's been suggested by Deputy Minister Bondar, it's been suggested by the previous president, but I have not heard in my chain what is the direction from the Government of Canada. I think they will welcome the opportunity, they'll examine it, they'll debate it, and we'll see what happens on the 9th of December.
We'll have to see on the 9th of December what's going to happen.
It does, absolutely. We will always continue to support our training efforts, and our focus right now is continue to do that. So it is continuing to train up the armed forces of Ukraine. We're also supporting the National Guard of Ukraine as well. We have 200 soldiers from Canada that are here. We are here until 2022 under our current mandate. Even when that mandate comes due, our government will make a decision, prior to that, whether or not we extend.
Whenever I've spoken to Canadian officers on the ground in Yavoriv, and there's also a smaller contingent in Desna, and from one officer I heard that their personal opinion was that they don't see Canadian troops leaving Ukraine anytime soon.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's what I would agree with that. My point is that it's our government that has to make that decision.
How Operation Unifier has developed and transformed since 2015, and sort of what was important then and what's important now, and say by 2022, what are going to be the goals then? 15,
we were really focused at being at the base in Starichi, at the International Peace and Security Center. And that focus was really on mentoring and training at sort of a brigade level. So we would take a collective training event, we would train a bunch of soldiers within their formations, and we would get them ready for operations to be used as the Ukrainian Armed Forces deems fit. We had small pockets as training missions or training teams that would go out, and they would provide periodic training, focused mainly on first aid and on engineer support. And what we noticed as the mission evolved is we said, we are going to the same bases over and over again, so it actually makes more sense to provide a more permanent presence. So right now, when you think of the 200 soldiers that we've got from Op Unifier, we've only got somewhere between 60 and 70 that are probably in Starichi today. The rest are actually scattered throughout parts of Ukraine. So we're in 12 different locations now. What
about the military policing mission? I understand Canada plays a significant role in helping to bolster and create a NATO-style military policing mission in Ukraine. And recently, President Zelensky said that this was at the start of November, that it must be created by the end of the year, based on the level of assistance that Canada has provided over the past few years. What do you think is the main what are the main roadblocks that are stopping Ukraine from establishing this military police force?
Oh, good question. So we started a military police training presence back in sort of 2015 when we first arrived. And what we've been doing is providing advisory support to the senior leadership of the military police here in Ukraine. So Lieutenant General Kirsten. Where we have focused our efforts has been at their training academy in Lviv. And at the same time, we've also been looking at policies that they need to implement to make a much more effective and stronger military police organization. Why President Zelensky actually made that announcement in early November is that there were a series of laws that have been brought forward to the Rada, one of which was the reform of the military police. And it is currently in debate in the Rada. And what we envision is going to happen is that there will be a healthy discussion as to what is the role of the military police and where does that butt up against the roles of national police or investigative bodies that actually look at investigative procedures. And that's an area which sometimes can be a little bit contentious. We have that same situation in Canada, and every Western military has it, where if you have a military police that does investigative responsibilities, who watches out from a civilian side to make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
You mentioned Lieutenant General Ihor Kristun. He's the commander of the Military Law and Order Service of Ukraine, and I spoke to him over the summer about some of the developments and the progress, and also what he sees as some of the setbacks and what could be done better potentially. And he said an interesting thing to me during the interview. He said that some of our law enforcement agencies do not want to have another agency that has similar functions. Especially strong opposition comes from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is against the creation of the military police force with more functions. This is what he said as his personal view. Would you say that's a major concern?
Absolutely, it would be a major concern. One of the challenges I think in Ukraine right now is that the government needs to consider an economy of effort, and if you have all of these different organizations having similar functions, then you've got to make sure that you understand what responsibilities each one of them has. The Ministry of Interior right now controls the National Police. The National Police has a large role in investigative responsibilities. Does it therefore make sense to have the military police do those same types of activities? And to what level does it reach? And those are the kinds of questions that need to be debated in the Rada. And so I agree with General Christian, and I also agree with the Ministry of Interior, and it's up to Ukraine to figure out that healthy debate.
In the context of hybrid war in Ukraine, how has the Canadian military adapted its mandate and tactic when it comes to training here in Ukraine?
It's a buzzword that's permeating all of the militaries across the world, and the question is, what does it really mean? And I'm no expert in hybrid warfare, so I can't say what exactly we're doing. In terms of the training, one area in particular, as I mentioned earlier, was the idea of social media and disinformation. So we certainly try to bring awareness to our soldiers as they're preparing to come over to Ukraine, that this is a factor, that there may be information that gets out that's incorrect or fake, and we have to make sure that we are recognizing where the information came from, what was the intent of that information, and what are the messages that we should be using to counter it.
Can you give some examples of how, again, in the context of hybrid war, because it's such a strong word that's now featured almost everywhere, media, politics, how has the Canadian military adapted its mandate? But can you give specific examples of how the approach was in 2015 and how it is now, considering how much the Canadian military knows as well, having troops here on the ground?
I'm probably not the best person to give you specific examples. Certainly I have seen media reports that have come out from disreputable media outlets, which suggests that Canadian soldiers have been killed in various activities, even in the Donbas. And when you get a piece of information like that, you go, all right, I'm the Canadian Defense Attaché here. One of my jobs is to know what Canadian military are actually in the country at any one time. And I can tell you that there was no Canadians ever operating in the Donbas. And certainly there have never been any Canadians killed here. So we have to counter that with factual information.
And is that one of the sort of striking examples of when you've seen hybrid warfare, so-called hybrid warfare, which includes propaganda and false narratives? Was that the sort of strongest example for you that you've seen here in Ukraine?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I think we've seen. I would say that is probably the strongest one, because when you think about it, when that piece of information gets out, that a Canadian soldier has been killed, that then gets picked up by reputable media outlets, and that information then could spin out of control if it's not handled correctly.
So it sounds like the Center of Excellence to sort of counter these hybrid threats is exactly what is needed.
Exactly. Yeah, that is one area. I mean, I know that Deputy Minister Frolova, one of her mandates is to look at strategic communications and also look at the hybrid threat. And certainly we will work with her and her office to try and develop what are the options, what are the spaces where Canada could assist or to learn from to counter these threats.
Thanks so much for speaking with me today. We were joined by Colonel Robert Foster, and we've been speaking about Canada-Ukraine military cooperation. You're watching UATV.